Yes, sir. Silence stretched across the chamber. Then Elder Voss rose from the far end of the table. He was ancient by any species measure. His joints clicked when he moved. His eyes had gone a clouded silver with age. But when he spoke, everyone listened, because Elder Voss had been old enough to be present the last time humanity had sent a warship into the sector, and he alone in that room understood what that memory actually meant. "They warned us," he said simply. Several council members shifted in their seats. A few looked away. The facts were not in dispute, only their significance. And the Empire had spent months constructing elaborate reasons why the significance was manageable. For months prior, an Imperial resource expedition had moved into the Terra system, a mineral-rich cluster near the outer boundary of recognized human territory. The colonial charter was technically ambiguous. The Empire's legal team had produced a 40-page document arguing the system fell within unclaimed space. The expedition had moved in, established extraction infrastructure, and begun operations. 3 days after operations began, a single human transmission had arrived, unencrypted, addressed directly to the Imperial throne, containing 11 words. "This territory is protected. Do not cross this line again." The Emperor had convened a private council. Analysts had argued that humanity was fractured, stretched thin across its vast territory, distracted by the internal politics that alien observers had spent centuries expecting to finally pull human civilization apart. The message, the council concluded, was a formality, a show. The humans would not escalate over one small system. They had been wrong in ways that were only now becoming fully clear. 3 days ago, said a young intelligence officer who had been waiting at the edge of the chamber for the right moment to speak and who had now decided there would be no right moment, "One of our patrol fleets entered restricted human space near the Harith Corridor. Standard reconnaissance. They transmitted their position on schedule at departure." He swallowed. "They have not transmitted since. We have received no distress signal. No debris has been detected. They are simply absent." The chamber temperature seemed to drop. The Emperor's hands, resting on the arms of his throne, tightened almost imperceptibly. He was a man who had built a career on projecting absolute composure, and he projected it now with everything he had. But those hands told the truth. "So this is not an invasion," he said quietly. Elder Voss shook his head. "No, Your Majesty. This is a response." On the screen, the Human Battle Cruiser grew incrementally larger. It did not waver. It did not accelerate or decelerate. It simply came, with the patience of something that had already decided how the story ended, and was merely waiting for everyone else to catch up. Across the Empire's territory, across hundreds of systems, thousands of inhabited worlds, billions of civilians who had woken that morning to ordinary lives. The alert spread. Defense fleets scrambled to formation. Shield arrays charged to full capacity. News broadcasts struggled to find the language for what was happening, because no one in living memory had needed to find it before. Children pressed their faces to observation windows and looked up at skies that seemed suddenly thinner. Soldiers checked their weapons and tried not to think about what they'd heard about human military doctrine in the war academies, where it was taught not as a threat assessment but as a historical curiosity, something from the distant past, preserved in amber. The Human Battle Cruiser arrived in silence. No shockwave, no blinding emergence flash. One moment the defense line's forward sensors showed empty space. The next, it didn't. The vessel simply existed in a place that had not existed a heartbeat before, as though the universe had quietly rearranged itself to accommodate it. The alien fleet froze. It was enormous. That word, enormous, felt inadequate in the way that calling an ocean what felt inadequate. The vessel's hull was a deep, non-reflective black of materials engineered to absorb rather than scatter light, so that it appeared not as an object in space, but as an absence, a vast, ship-shaped hole in the stars through which nothing shone. Its running lights were minimal, deliberate, like eyes in the dark. At its stern, twin drives burned with a cold, contained blue that suggested not fury but capability, the difference between a fire built to warm a room and a fire built to burn a forest, both controlled, only one of them kind. It did not target anyone. That was a detail that reached deepest into the marrows of the defense fleet's commanders. A weapon aimed at you is frightening, but a weapon not yet aimed at something else entirely. The human ship simply floated at the edge of the defense line, occupying space the way mountains occupy landscapes, without apology, without explanation, as though it had always been there and always would be. Then the transmission came through, not on the military emergency band, but on every channel simultaneously, civilian and military alike, reaching every screen and speaker in every vessel, station, and settlement within range. This is Human Battle Cruiser Resolute. The voice was a woman's, measured, clear, carrying a particular kind of authority that doesn't need volume to fill a room. You cross a protected border. You were warned. In the Capitol chamber, the Emperor watched the screen and said nothing. Around him, his council said nothing. There was, for a long moment, nothing useful to say. "We are not here for conquest," the voice continued. A brief pause, not uncertain, but deliberate, the pause of someone who understands the weight of words and refuses to spend them carelessly. "We are here for correction." The defense fleet's weapons powered up, across dozens of vessels, targeting systems locked. Shield emitters surged to maximum output. The commanders understood it was gesture more than strategy. They had seen the mass readings, run the calculations, quietly and privately concluded things they had not shared with their subordinates. But military training is, at its core, training against the impulse to do nothing, and so that they did something. The Resolute moved, not toward them, not toward anything in particular. It shifted its position with a slowness that was almost contemplative, rotating until its profile blocked the light of the nearest star. For a moment, the entire defense line fell into its shadow, and in that shadow they understood, not intellectually, but in the deeper, older way that living things understand the proximity of things much larger than themselves, that this ship was not afraid of them, had never been afraid of them, had not made a single calculation in which their weapons factored as a meaningful variable. It looked like a wall built between worlds. Inside the defense fleet's flagship, Commander Reth had been listening to his officers argue for 10 minutes and had made his decision in the first 30 seconds. He was not a stupid man. He understood the mathematics. But he was a military commander who had spent his career in a culture that interpreted caution as cowardice, and that culture had built itself into him at a level deeper than reason. "They are bluffing," he said. "It is one ship. One ship." "Sir, the mass readings alone suggest." "One ship," he repeated, and his voice had the flat, final quality of a man who has chosen a story and will live inside it regardless of the evidence. "Target their primary hull. Fire on my mark." "Sir." "Mark." The energy beam that left Reth's cruiser was the most powerful weapon in the Imperial Defense Fleet's arsenal. It lit up the sector like a second sun being born, a brilliant lance of coherent energy crossing the distance between the ships in less than a second. It struck the Resolute's shields. Light bloomed, impossible, beautiful, terrifying light, the kind that made observers shield their eyes even through filtered view screens. Energy cascaded across the human ship's shielding in waves, spreading and dispersing and spreading further, a stunning display of force meeting force. Then it faded. The Resolute had not moved, had not angled to absorb the blow more favorably, had not taken evasive action or returned fire, or done anything at all except sit there, while the Empire's most powerful weapon spent itself against its hull like rain against stone. Not a scratch, not a tremor, not so much as a shift in the angle of those cold blue engines. Across the fleet, across the sector, across every screen showing the encounter live throughout the Empire, there was a silence so complete it had a texture, like the moment after a bell stops ringing when the sound's gone, but something of it remains in the air. Commander Reth ordered his weapons officer to fire again. The weapons officer never did. The Resolute responded. One turret rotated. A single weapon's emplacement among what appeared to be dozens along the vessel's spine, selected with a kind of deliberate restraint that communicated more than a full broadside ever could. A beam emerged, thinner than the one that had just struck it, barely visible, a thread of blue light, so precisely controlled it seemed almost delicate. It touched Reth's cruiser. The cruiser's engines died. Every system went dark in sequence. Propulsion, weapons, communications, shields, in a cascade so clean and orderly it seemed almost surgical, a physician disabling a threat without unnecessary trauma. The vessel went dark and still, drifting in the silence of its own powerlessness. Intact, unharmed, crew alive, ship dead, disabled, not destroyed. The human captain's voice returned immediately, as though she had been waiting precisely for this moment. Your attack has been recorded. The tone was the same. No anger, no satisfaction, no theatrical pause for effect. Just a statement, laid down like a document. We will not strike civilians. We will not destroy without cause. A breath, but we will end threats. Across the defense line, weapons powered down. Not by order. No commander gave instruction, but by a kind of collective intuition that moved the fleet like a tide going out. Officers looked at their targeting screens, and then looked at the Resolute, and then looked at their screens again, and the mathematics of the situation made the decision for them. The Resolute had been fired upon. It had responded by disabling the attacker. It had specifically, demonstrably chosen not to destroy. That precision, that terrifying, deliberate, surgical mercy, was somehow more frightening than destruction would have been. Destruction could be answered with anger, with pride, with the old warrior calculus of death or death. But this could only be answered with honesty, and honesty said, we cannot hurt them, and they know it, and they are choosing to let us live anyway. And the price of that mercy is everything they're about to ask for. In the capital chamber, Emperor Dravith had stopped listening to his generals argue. He was watching the screen, watching the dark shape of the Resolute hanging in space with its single disabled kill. One shot, one warning, infinite patience. And he was feeling something move through him that he could not immediately name. He named it. Finally, when the next alert came through, multiple warp signatures detected. Outer system, bearing inbound. The signatures arrived in dozens. Then scores. They emerged from warp at measured intervals, with a choreography so precise it could only have been rehearsed, or simply a reflection of the kind of institutional discipline that made rehearsal unnecessary. Cruisers, destroyers, carrier vessels, support ships. They arranged themselves in a formation behind the Resolute so clean, so geometrically perfect, that it looked less like a fleet and more like an architectural feature of space itself. Something that had always been there, waiting to be revealed. They had been there, all along, hidden, watching, not because they had needed to hide, but because they had chosen to, because they had wanted the Empire to make its choice freely, without the pressure of an overwhelming presence. They had given the Empire every opportunity to surrender with dignity before making dignity irrelevant. The council chamber had gone beyond silence into something that had no name, a collective state of shock so complete that individual emotion had been subsumed into a single, shared understanding. Elder Voss sat down heavily in his chair and did not look triumphant or vindicated. He looked sad, in the way that people who have been right about terrible things are always a little sad. The human captain spoke for the final time. Our fleet is present. No pride, no theater. A statement, nothing more. We request the surrender of those responsible for the border violation and the unlawful attack on this vessel. We request this once. The Emperor rose from his throne. He stood for a long moment looking at the image on the screen. At the Resolute at the center of its fleet, at the long, dark hull that had crossed the sector alone and confident, and willing to die if necessary, except that it hadn't been necessary, because it was not built to die in exchanges like this. It was built to end exchanges like this. He thought about the colony and the terror system, the minerals, the legal document, the 40 pages of careful argument for why a clear line could be interpreted as no line at all. He thought about the 11-word message that had arrived afterward and the Council's comfortable conclusion that humanity was too busy, too divided, too internally distracted to act. He understood now what they had misread. Humanity's internal arguments, their perpetual self-examination, their endless democratic friction. It wasn't weakness wearing the costume of civilization. It was civilization, and it had produced, over centuries, a military culture that was not driven by ambition or hunger or the need to prove dominance. It was driven by something much simpler and, in this moment, much more terrifying. They meant it, every word, every warning, every line drawn in every treaty signed across 1,000 years of expanding contact with alien civilizations. They meant all of it, and they had the patience to wait until meaning needed to be demonstrated, and the capability to demonstrate without losing a single one of their own. Stand down, the Emperor said. The words moved through the command chain in seconds. Across the defense fleet, weapons went offline. Shields dimmed. The fleet's posture changed from something taut and trembling to something exhausted and still, like a creature that has been holding its breath and finally had to breathe. The formal surrender transmission was prepared. The commanders responsible, Ref, who had fired without authorization, the expedition directors who had ordered the tear of operation over treaty objections, 2 council members who had advocated for ignoring the human warning, were removed from their positions. Orders were drafted for their arrest. Everything was documented, time-stamped, transmitted directly to the Resolute with all credentials attached. Several long seconds passed. Then the human captain appeared on every screen in the galaxy. She was not what the Empire had imagined in the moments when they'd imagined anything. She was not imposing by physical measure, of middle years, composed, wearing a uniform that bore no decoration beyond its rank insignia. Her face held a particular kind of stillness that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the long practice of governing it. When she spoke, she looked directly into the lens the way humans do when they want you to understand they are not speaking for performance. We accept your surrender. A pause, but not a cold one. Human borders exist for peace, not for power. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your resources, your territory, or your submission. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite warmth, but close to it. The look of someone who believed the thing they're saying and wishes they hadn't needed to say it this way. But we protect what is ours. Every treaty we sign is a promise, and every promise we make is real. Cross our border with respect, and you'll find friends. Cross it with force. She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The transmission ended. No fanfare. No declaration of victory. No terms of occupation to be negotiated, no garrison to be installed, no governor installed to administer a humble province. The human fleet's formation held for exactly 90 seconds after the captain's image disappeared from the screens. Then, one by one, with the same unhurried precision they had arrived with, the ships of the human fleet turned and entered warp. The Resolute went last. It seemed to hang there for a moment after the rest had gone. Whether that was intentional or simply perspective of a billion watching eyes projecting meaning onto physics, no one could say. It hung there in the dark, huge and quiet, blocking no stars now, and then it folded into itself and was gone. Space was empty again. Or rather, space looked the way it always had. But it didn't feel that way. It felt different in the way a room feels different after someone remarkable has walked through it. The air still holding the shape of their passage, even after they've gone. The Empire survived. That was the thing that took days to fully comprehend. Not the defeat, which was expected once the mathematics became clear, but the fact that they were still here. Every ship in the fleet was intact, minus one cruiser drifting powerless but whole, its crew already being recovered. Not a single civilian planet had been targeted. Not one city had seen fire from orbit. The humans had come to the edge of what they would permit, drawn a line in the physics of space itself, extracted accountability from those responsible, and left. No conquest, no punishment beyond justice, no satisfaction in domination. In the days that followed, in council chambers and military academies and late-night conversations in 1,000 different languages across hundreds of different worlds, people tried to understand what they had witnessed. Some called it mercy. Some called it tactics, the restraint of a civilization that understood that a living, functioning empire makes a better neighbor than a shattered one. Some called it arrogance, the supreme confidence of power that knows it doesn't need to stamp its name on what it defeats. Elder Voss, who had been present when the transmission was sent, and present when the fleet disappeared, and present in all the difficult hours in between, called it something simpler. Integrity, he said, to a young aide who had asked him, late at night, what word he would use. They said what they meant. They did what they said. That's all it was. He looked out the chamber window at the stars, which looked the same as they always had, and which would never mean quite the same thing again. It's rarer than it should be. Across the galaxy, one truth settled into the permanent record of civilizations, written into military doctrine, into diplomatic training, into the stories parents told children when they wanted to explain the difference between power and strength. The humans did not boast. They did not threaten loudly or often. They built their borders with care and defended them with patience. They warned once with words. And if those words were not enough, if someone decided that a line existed only until you chose to cross it, the humans arrived. Not loudly, not with speeches or proclamations or the performance of might. They simply arrived. And when they arrived, they brought with them something more durable than firepower, the absolute, demonstrated, galaxy-wide understanding that they meant exactly what they said. Every word, every time. And the galaxy, for once, listened. The outer trade sector was quiet the way deep space always is. Not peaceful, exactly, but patient. Cargo haulers drifted along their programmed lanes like slow-moving islands, their running lights blinking in the dark. Patrol vessels swept their sensors across the void in long, unhurried arcs. Nothing moved that wasn't supposed to. Nothing breathed that wasn't scheduled to. Junior Officer Kael'tach had been staring at his radar console for 4 hours straight when the signal appeared. He blinked, looked away, looked back. It was still there, a single pale smear on the long-range display, at the outermost edge of the sensor's reach. Too faint to be certain of. Too persistent to ignore. He ran a diagnostic. The equipment was fine. He recalibrated the array. The signal remained, and it was moving, not drifting, not decelerating. Moving with the kind of deliberate, locked-in velocity that suggested something very large traveling very fast with absolutely nowhere else it needed to be. "Captain," he said, and something in his voice made the bridge go quiet before he even finished a word. Captain Vora crossed the floor in 6 steps and leaned over the console. The data scrolled across his face in cold light. He watched it for a long moment without speaking. Around them, officers pretended to continue working, but had stopped. "Range," Vora asked. "Closing, sir. Whatever it is, it's well beyond standard civilian tonnage." "Energy signature?" The data officer, a veteran named Sarek who had served 30 years on patrol and prided himself on never having been surprised by anything, began his scan. His fingers moved with practiced confidence. Then they slowed. Then they stopped entirely. The color drained from his face so completely that the bioluminescent markings along his jaw flickered and went dim. "Sarek," the captain said quietly. "Report." The officer turned from his screen with the careful movements of someone who had just found something in the dark and wasn't sure whether to run or stand still. "The energy pattern, sir," he said. "It's old, pre-modern signature, but unmistakable." He paused. "It matches human military design." No one moved. The bridge or patrol vessel is never truly silent. Cooling systems hiss. Data terminals chirp. Air recyclers hum their endless low note. But in that moment, every soul on that deck became acutely aware of all those sounds, because the human silence underneath them was so complete. Humans. The word moved through the crew like a current. Not spoken aloud. No one dared, but felt, remembered. In this part of space, human warships were not a thing you simply encountered. They were a thing you heard about in the way you heard about orbital disasters or collapsed stars. Something that happened somewhere else, to someone else, for reasons that made terrible, irrefutable sense in retrospect. "Get me the High Council," Captain Vora said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "Now!" The emergency transmission moved faster than the ship ever could. By the time the signal reached the capital system, analysts had already begun pulling historical records, cross-referencing energy signatures, arguing in urgent whispers in darkened rooms. By the time the High Council gathered in the silver chamber beneath the spire, they had all the information they needed and none of the comfort. The chamber was a masterpiece of Imperial architecture, vaulted ceilings that caught sound and softened it, walls inlaid with the mineral records of conquered systems, light that fell in calculated angles to make those who stood at the center feel observed and significant. Tonight, it made everyone feel small. Emperor Dravis sat at the head of the curved council table and studied the image on the central screen. The human vessel was still too distant for visual clarity, but its mass reading was extraordinary. It moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that only truly dangerous things can afford. "How long?" the Emperor asked. "For hours," replied Commander Thiel, the defense minister, a broad-shouldered figure who had overseen a dozen military campaigns and who was now, visibly, try to remember everything he knew about human doctrine, and finding the inventory disturbingly short. It has not altered speed or trajectory since first detection. It is not scanning us. It is not attempting communication. It is simply coming. Then it knows where it's going, the Emperor said.